Thank you to the panelists for being here, and thank you all for joining us today. Just a very quick introduction. My name is Chris McClean. I am the global lead for digital ethics at a company called Avanade. Avanade is about a 50,000 person digital innovation and tech consulting firm. We work primarily in the Microsoft ecosystem, which means we work on everything from cloud computing and workplace experience all the way to artificial intelligence and blockchain. And in my role, I have really two kind of aspects of that role. One is internally, I do a lot of work around training, workshops, and program design and process design to help make sure our employees understand how to identify and hopefully address some of the ethical issues that could arise in the technology that we're working on. And then I also have an advisory service where I help our clients build their own digital ethics capabilities. And in the 2 years I've been in this role, I think by far the most time I've spent is around responsible AI. I think primarily because it's getting a lot of attention, these sort of technologies that we place under the umbrella that we call AI, but also it brings up a lot of dilemmas, a lot of quandaries that we really haven't dealt with in the tech industry. Or at least there's a sense of urgency because these technologies that we call AI increase speed, increase scale, so it makes us feel like these dilemmas are more urgent. So I'm very excited about our panel today, very excited to talk about responsible AI, and especially because we have three terrific experts. So I'm going to jump right into it. We have Ayodele Odubela. Ayodele is a CEO and co-founder of Ethical AI Champions, also a digital science career coach, also a responsible AI educator. We have Phaedra Boinodiris, who, among other things, is a Trust in AI business transformation leader at IBM. And we have Renata Barreto. And Renata is currently a JD and PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. So really great set of expertise and background here. Ayodele, we're going to start with you. I know you have a very kind of diverse background, really impressive background in data science, and in fact, actually a master's in data science. But since that career path, you have also gotten into responsible AI as an educator, as a champion, and now running your own consulting business in responsible AI. Can you talk a little bit about what brought you into this discipline of responsible AI, how you made that journey, and what you're doing in this space now?
Absolutely. So I actually just transitioned careers into data science for marketing and didn't really understand. I had a master's level course on social justice and ethical issues, but it wasn't really comprehensive. And so when I got into the workforce, I started getting requests like, can we create a gender identifier to classify people's gender based on their first name for marketing purposes? And so as these requests would come up, I would start to get weird feelings and attempt to pivot into other kinds of modeling techniques. But I started to recognize that this was a larger issue of how we approach using user data to make predictions that are beneficial for marketing, operations, just general business, was really at conflict with kind of what's best for users as far as privacy protection. So starting to understand that, I started to kind of dig into papers, really start reading, and understand from a research perspective, what were ways that we could start to mitigate this or start to encourage organizations to work a little bit differently. So I started to see these things come up, and then I've had issues using specific technologies. So as a woman with darker skin, when I'm working with facial recognition or even playing around with these fairly commercial grade APIs, they don't work as well for me personally. So I think having that experience in combination with understanding from a business perspective why or what are the motives for these kinds of algorithms, I was like, there is a bit more we can do here to try and shift how organizations build these tools.
And then how specifically did you make the switch into responsible AI?
Yeah, that was actually just came with a career switch. I had the opportunity to dig in a little bit earlier this year, more on the MLOps side of things to understand how we track observability and the metrics we can use to understand if our fairness is drifting. And my most recent roles have been actually turning this large body of fairness research into smaller digestible bits so that engineers are able to understand as they're coding, as they're building projects, how to build things a little bit more responsibly. And so, that came with a couple of recent job switches.
Very nice. And we'll definitely get back to that sort of engineering and documentation. Phaedra, also really impressive background. You've had a lot of roles just in the last 10 years or so at IBM. You've been involved in gaming and gamification and tech strategy and blockchain. Similar question, how did you make that switch into responsible AI? And what are you focused on right now?
Excellent question. So currently, it sounds like my role is very similar to what you're doing at Avanade. So I'm working directly with our clients to help them be more responsible curators of artificial intelligence. And working with them specifically on holistic approaches towards tackling that socio-technological challenge that is earning trust in AI, right? And I became interested in this because I was so disappointed by what I was reading in the news. There were so many stories about either from one extreme, just outright malintent with respect to the use of AI, particularly to manipulate people, and or even with organizations that had the very best of intentions that they were causing either individual or societal harm, and it just bugged me. So I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could about the space, and ended up pursuing a PhD in AI and ethics. I'm now in year 2, so I'm a PhD candidate through the University College Dublin, and really started to socialize the idea of bringing some of these best practices to our customers, and started working with a wonderful group at IBM to tackle the issue. So it's been the journey.
Very good, yeah. And then finally, Renata, so you have a background with work experience with Twitter, with Facebook, but currently you are in academia, working at UC Berkeley on a JD and a PhD. This intersection is really fascinating for me between technology and law, which has come up actually quite a bit in the sessions earlier today. So can you describe a little bit about your tech background and then what brought you into this current field of research?
Yeah, so my background is in computational social science. That's what I focused on in undergrad. And when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do for grad school, I had to do a little bit of soul searching. I knew I liked poli-sci, I knew I liked econ, but I was mainly interested in issues of power and how they played out in terms of discrimination. And I thought that there was a really big gap in how even fields that are more amenable to that sort of analysis, like sociology, approach this issue. So I knew that I was interested in like science and technology studies, how technologies shifted power among people. But I had my first experience being the subject of one of these technological artifacts when I was traveling from Brazil back to the US. I was born in Brazil. And so after college, I went to Brazil for a couple of months. And upon returning into the US, I noticed that at the Houston airport, they had these automated kiosks. So I was going through the kiosk, I had my passport scanned, had my picture taken, and I immediately received this receipt with a giant X, a red X over my face, telling me that I needed to go for further screening. And so I started looking around, kind of put my social scientist hat on, and noticed that these two lines were forming. One line where it was mainly people of color, people with accents, folks who maybe had dual passports, and another line that was mainly white folks and maybe people who only had one passport. And I was trying to figure out why this was happening. There wasn't any clear there wasn't any clear pattern as to the underlying mechanisms of what these kiosks were spitting out. And when I asked the officer why I was selected for further screening, he said that it had something to do with my name, my name has a hyphen in it. It's I usually go by one last name, but it's a double last name in the tradition of most Latin American folks. And so the system wasn't able to read that. It was taking that as some sort of mistake. And I started wondering about what other mistakes were happening under the hood. And so I've dedicated my PhD to trying to understand the technical artifacts from a social science perspective. So to that end, I've also interned at Twitter, done a visiting researcher gig at Facebook, which I'm currently at, and brought in those perspectives to places that honestly haven't approached things with a social scientist lens before. So it's been really refreshing to start at a time. I started my PhD in 2015, and that's when things really started rolling. So it's been really exciting to be a part of this field. You also asked about law. Law is, I think, another kind of interest of mine in terms of righting wrongs. And it's also a way that power moves through society. So I think that's what's brought me to do the JD. There are a lot of parallels in terms of how computer scientists approach problems and how legal scholars also approach problems. There's a lot of like bucketing of things and thinking through like logical issues at play. And I think that both of those perspectives are really valuable and important. But one of the things that really strikes me is that there's an emphasis on procedural justice in both computer science and in the law. If we do things step by step, we're going to get to the right answer. And what I'm trying to kind of like shift through my scholarship is thinking about substantive justice. Like even if we follow all the right steps, we're not always going to get to the right answer, and trying to bring that way of approaching problems to both computer science and to law.
I appreciate that. And I think, especially as I talk with people, I try to give them the sense of urgency that these responsible AI problems are not hypothetical. They're real. They're causing real damage right now. So I appreciate your example, especially. And Ayodele, we talked a little bit just last week about this imbalance of power that Renata mentioned, right? So law is one way that power shifts. And I really like that idea of sort of procedural versus substantial justice. You mentioned this idea of power imbalance. So it's not just bias, although bias in algorithms is a problem, but the power imbalance is also a big problem. Can you define the power imbalance and maybe give us some examples about how bad it is?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. So one of the issues is that there's a huge imbalance in the way that tech orgs kind of operate, in that users, while contributing all of this data, usually for free, have little say about how it gets used and are not really told how it gets used. So the organizations have not only the power, they also have the power really comes from that user data, and that they can sell it. They can profit off of it directly. A lot of times they use that data to fuel their marketing ad dollars in their marketplaces. But I think what's difficult is that it kind of expands to nearly every area of tech. So even when we're looking at content moderation, the voices who studies have actually shown us that specific groups of marginalized people end up being moderated more frequently than others. And then you combine this with the statistics that are public about who works at these large organizations who have arms that do content moderation, and our diversity stats are pretty awful. So given that, we have limited groups of people, so typically people in dominant groups, both contributing to the body of knowledge, so like even what's on the internet, which is things off of Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, that are actually used to train like codecs and fuel things like GitHub Copilot. But then the people who are also in charge of moderating this content come from these same dominant groups. So I think that it spreads into nearly every aspect, whether we're talking about content moderation or data privacy. We are almost always at marginalized people are almost always re-marginalized kind of by how we operate and how we pretty much run our organizations.
Yeah, all fair points. And Phaedra, you mentioned earlier this idea of this being a socio-technical problem, right? So Ayodele brings up a lot of different cases where there are current social harms, and especially for people that have been historically marginalized. So how do you define this as a socio-technical problem? And does that give us any insight onto how we might solve some of these problems?
Yes, and I really appreciate that Ayodele spoke directly to diversity, equity, and inclusivity, because it certainly is a challenge when thinking about the earning trust in AI being a socio-technological challenge. When thinking about it in this way holistically, it's really important to think not just about the technology, obviously, but the people, the process, and the tooling, right, that goes with it. And when thinking about things like the people or the culture of an organization needed to really curate responsible AI, Ayodele is right. You've got to be thinking about diversity. You've heard of the theorem, wisdom of crowds. That is a proven mathematical theorem. The larger the set of people, the more diverse the set of people, the less the error. And it is doubly so, triply so in the realm of AI. So when thinking about AI ethics, when it begins in your journey towards curating an AI model, it has to happen at the beginning. You've got to be thinking about who's on my team. Of this team of data scientists, how many are women? How many are minorities, right? Then incorporating things like tech ethics by design, doing design thinking workshops where you're thinking through, given this particular use case that I have in mind, what are not just the primary and secondary effects, but the tertiary unintended effects? And then how, given the values of my organization, how can I consider what are the rights of the end users, whether they're my employees or whether they're my clients, and then how do I design in order to mitigate for any potential harm? All of this gets wrapped into culture, right? And thinking about, how do you seed a responsible culture within an organization such that people don't feel like it's this litigation hurdle, it's something onerous that they've got to overcome, but instead really wear it as a badge of honor. Then, of course, thinking about things like process and governance. What are you going to promise, not just to your own employee base with respect to the standards you're going to hold by for AI models, but what are you going to promise to the market? And then what's the tooling, the AI engineering methods, the frameworks that you're going to adopt to make sure that people are all in lockstep when thinking about ethics as part of the AI model lifecycle? That's what I mean by holistic approach. It's not a one thing, one siloed approach. It's really meant to be holistic.
Yeah, all of that makes perfect sense. It's a lot, right? I think when we talked last week, you said there's no easy button. This is going to be a very complicated, complex set of solutions for this. And I know, Renata, we spoke a little bit about representation, and I think Phaedra made a great point about who's involved in building the tech, pulling the data together, designing the algorithms and the use cases. So right now, AI is being used to screen out applicants. It's being used to decide who gets a voice in different platforms. And I know you've spoken a lot about sort of representation. So given, as Phaedra says, that this is a very complex problem with a lot of complex solutions, what should we be aiming for? Is there some sort of democratization of AI? Is it more regulation? Do you think the big corporations are going to help us kind of solve some of these problems? Where do you see the path forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the point of representation is well taken. When you have people from different backgrounds working on a problem together, you tend to have more creative solutions. But I'm not sure that that's enough, because it's not just about different backgrounds in terms of gender, race, disability, sexual orientation. It's also about like a particular training and approach to these things. So I think that there has to be have humanities scholars join not just the conversation, but have them have a seat at the table when it comes to thinking about the consequences of putting a machine learning model in production. And I think that ends up happening a lot in academia, but not as much in tech. So bringing in voices from different disciplines is really critical. But I think the broader point about the path forward, there's a lot of citizen hackers, I guess you could call them, who are messing around with the outputs of models on the other end. I've seen this on TikTok, where a good colleague of mine at Berkeley did a couple of passes on TikTok by creating accounts that had different names, different gender choices, and then seeing what type of recommendations they were given as soon as they started their account. What type of videos were they given? Videos that catered to a particular assumption about gender or about a particular racial assumption from their name. Super interesting work. And then also we see that happening with the Twitter bounty challenge, where you were supposed to see if you could break the machine learning model that would zoom in on a particular salient part of an image of a person. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of this type of creativity being deployed, where it's not just, 10, 15, 20 people in a room who are deciding how a model should be shipped and what the potential limits of a model are, but instead it's open to thousands of people, maybe even millions, depending on who has the technical capabilities. So that's, I think, a really exciting front for being able to see where the limits are of the responsible tech. Okay,
so we all four of us have some connection with big tech. You've worked with Twitter and Facebook, and Phaedra is with IBM, and Ayodele's worked with Microsoft, and Avanade's parent companies are Microsoft and Accenture. So Renata, I think what you're saying is, yes, these companies are maybe moving in a direction, but it's going to require more of a grassroots, maybe citizen activism, kind of push, right? Pressure to get these big companies to change.
I think that I don't know what it's going to take for companies to change, but I think in terms of seeing how models, where the limits are of particular models, I think this new pattern that's being put forward by Twitter and other citizen hackers is really interesting, because it's kind of what you were saying before, democratizing the process of finding the boundaries of machine learning models.
Okay. So Phaedra, you mentioned the idea of trust in AI. That's actually in your title. So what does it look like? Let's say we do have citizens putting more pressure. We do have a more diverse group that are building AI and participating. What does that look like if we do it right? What does trust in AI look like for us?
It takes a lot. As I mentioned, there's no easy button. It takes a lot to earn trust in an AI model. And it's more than just tackling bias, right? So you need to answer the question, is this fair? But you also need to answer the question, is it explainable? Can I understand, by interacting with this model, what's the data lineage and provenance? What data sets were used to come up with this decision? What expertise, what methods, right? Then robustness. Could this model be hacked in such a way as to disadvantage whole swaths of groups of people and advantage me over everybody else? Transparency. Do people even know that an AI model is being used to make this decision? Where can I go for more information? And then does it ensure the people's data privacy? So these are all things, these are at least IBM's 5 pillars with respect to how to think about what does it take to earn trust in something like artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And we talk a lot about trust in different forms, right? So there's trust like reliability, like I trust this bridge is going to hold me. Or there's trust like consistency, where I trust that people are going to stop at a stoplight as I go through an intersection. But there's also values alignment, right? Do I trust my bank's algorithms are going to send me, or my healthcare company's algorithms are going to send me toward the right solutions? And I'm sorry, go ahead.
And there's a lot of interest right now and a lot of discussion in things like a good housekeeping seal of approval on an AI model, that somehow, the lay person will be able to look at that good housekeeping seal of approval and say, oh, I don't need to worry about my bank using this particular AI model on me because, you know, I can be assured that IEEE or the United Nations or the World Economic Forum, they have looked at this. There's a lot of questions about that too, though, right? Because certain AI models that may never be used by the public, maybe the weight associated with something like robustness would be less. Or if it's an AI model that's making decisions about microchips, maybe the weight associated with fairness would be less. So there's complexity there too. It can't just be, you know, take averages across all of them and slap up this score. And also you've got to think, this model is being trained over time with new data all the time. So when was that last audit when it got that score? And can I still trust it today? What's the level of freshness? So it is complex, and it's important to think about, you know, the question that you asked Renata about, you know, where is this all going, and, you know, what do we have to look forward to? I would say, you know, education. The more education we have, not just we in the business, but certainly as consumers, to be able to ask and look for things like transparency and explainability and proof that it is fair and these kinds of things. I think that's important, really, really important.
And then we'll get to education a little bit in a second, but Ayodele, you talk a lot about documentation, and I think that's an area that's very familiar to people that are in data science or in software engineering. But I think the way you look at it is a kind of a bigger picture on what it will take for us to really understand what's going on behind the scenes in this sort of umbrella of technologies we call AI. And as David mentioned earlier, we want to take this sort of big picture of AI principles and talk about how to make this practical. So I'm curious what you think software engineers and data scientists could be doing now around documentation or maybe other areas that could actually start to make some of these improvements that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I definitely think about documentation on a really broad and sort of high level scale, in that in organizations, we make so many decisions that impact our AI strategy down the line that we aren't really tracking anywhere. So I think that's a big aspect, in that, let's say we choose to optimize our search engine to prioritize clicks, and we absolutely want clicks, and that's what we prioritize. Then we will see the downstream effects of these search engines pulling up specific and typically bias based off of gender and race kind of results. Those are things that are getting clicks, but when we're not taking into account the social and behavioral side and only looking at some of these really narrow, like technical metrics, it's really easy to lose the fact that these decisions were made by business leaders and agreed upon and end up impacting our downstream products. So I think that's one aspect that is really organizational. And I'd say that goes hand in hand with this like issues backlog or known issues backlog, both in your domain as well as your organization, understanding what some of these known issues are. And I think that's where our analysts, data scientists, machine learning engineers can really help impact how we understand pretty much what we want to assess in a postmortem. So by being able to track some of the things that we are typically not doing, I've been at several organizations and almost no one takes the actual time to write a model card or to create a data sheet. And I do think that it either is going to take effort on our PM side and giving us time to do these steps, or it's going to take effort with some tooling to make sure that these do end up being created. I think it's difficult because these tools and these papers have been out for years and most organizations don't actually participate in creating them. So that is a step, and that's a blocker for being transparent. So Phaedra, earlier you mentioned building trust. And a huge key component of that is transparency, but it is few and far between to see any product page or any new API actually include their intended usage, to include the limitations, to speak very clearly to all users and all customers where they know that there are product failing. So even Google's come out with model cards, but if you go to any of their product pages and they use ML on almost every product, I as a user can't find where they've had issues. I can't find somewhere to submit that I've had an issue or to actually build recourse in. So a lot of this documentation will end up kind of driving these process changes, but without actually coming through, I think, on the other side of that and speaking very transparently to users and saying, we understand that there are issues in these kinds of deployments, explaining to customers that we don't expect you to use these in these scenarios. It is fair, it's few and far between. And I cannot say I've seen a product page that goes into that level of transparency and depth.
And I'm going to stick with you, Ayodele, for a second. I asked Renata the same question. How does this change? And I think very specifically, we see some big technology companies putting investment and effort into these changes, and their marketing that they're making these changes. They're hiring some people that have expertise in these areas. But what about other industries or that sort of second tier, outside of the Fortune 100? Or government institutions that are actually putting these algorithms into practice and currently having negative effects on people? If Google's not doing this in ML across their entire portfolio, what are we going to do differently that will help these mid-sized companies or government agencies or people outside of big tech start to take on some of these more practical mitigations? Ayodele, I'll start with you on that question.
Yeah, sorry. I definitely think that it's really going to take some shifting of priorities. And I think that understanding that the way we develop AI and the way that it's kind of morphed out of software engineering was kind of understandable in the beginning. And now we're starting to see that the human harms are related, and we need to start working not just with social scientists, but with behavioral scientists, even internally, to help us shift these priorities. I think when we start to look at when people start to value their kind of allyship with specific marginalized groups versus things that directly impact them, we almost always find that people are willing to budge on their affiliation for scenarios that are specifically beneficial. So if we're looking at product teams, leadership inside organizations, if all of these things are tied to metrics that are like accuracy or user adoption, we will continue to see this pattern of AI developed without regard for users because the priorities aren't to continuously be on the side of users. So I think by starting to shift these priorities internally, we can also start to shift them to prioritize fairness, and understanding that that means we're going to have to not only make trade-offs, but prioritize specific groups and draw these lines in the sand. We can't prioritize fairness for every single person. So I urge that we start with the most marginalized groups first. And then, at least historically speaking, we have a chance to create more equitable tech overall.
I like it. And Phaedra, I'll get to you in a second on this this sort of interaction and getting people involved. But Renata, we got a really interesting question from the audience, and I hadn't heard the phrase before, but it was really good. It was, how do we stimulate the moral imagination of individuals? So where Ayodele was talking about changing priorities, getting people involved, and especially marginalized communities to be involved. This idea of stimulating the moral imagination is very compelling for me. I'm curious if you see a way that you can see that we would get more people involved in this discipline and stimulate the moral imagination of people that are running project teams, running portfolios or businesses, so that they understand that they need to have a sense of urgency around these problems and get the right people involved to help solve them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've seen a couple of approaches to this. So out of the University of Washington in Seattle, there are some PhD students who are working on a game that they are trying to push out for product teams, where basically you try to take the perspective of someone else who shows up in a particular card in the game, and how the model, the technology, whatever it is that you're building would impact that particular person. I think that's one way of trying to stimulate the moral imagination, but I also think that there's a ton of resources out there, like the Radical AI podcast, that examine the intersection between machine learning and discrimination along different groups, whether it's gender or caste or disability, and really try to come at it not from a let's just calibrate everything so we make sure that the model's working well for everyone, but instead, what is the model actually doing? How does that impact people on the ground? And I think thinking about people first and who it's impacting is one way to stimulate the moral imagination.
I like it. Yeah, and if you remember the name of that game or the team, and you could put it in the chat for everybody, I think it's a great example. And actually, when you told me about Radical AI last week, I downloaded a couple episodes and listened to a great one just a couple days ago on caste system and how that is interplayed with AI. Phaedra, I know you have ideas around stimulating moral imagination. You were in gaming and gamification for a long time. You've done a lot of work around training and education, getting people to partner and collaborate. So curious what you think of that phrase, stimulating moral imagination, and what some of the ideas are that you've seen that work well.
I love the phrase, so kudos to whoever was in the audience who came up with that. I like it. I'm totally borrowing it from now on. A few things apart from standard education approaches, and I do have a lot to say about education. I know we're going to get to that. A couple of other things I think is really important when thinking about moral imagination and the cultures that are needed to help moral imagination take root, right? Really encouraging a culture that works across uncommon stakeholders, I think is key. So that groups of people don't just continue to work in their little silos without actually going and talking to each other. So for example, when you've got a team of data scientists that are thinking about which data sets to use to curate a model, bringing in the chief diversity and inclusivity officer, bringing in the chief legal officer, like, why are we not talking with each other? One thing that we've done within IBM that I think organizations could borrow is we've created something called a center of excellence around trustworthy AI. And what this is in essence, a platform for all different kinds of people within IBM with different kinds of backgrounds, not just data scientists, not just machine learning scientists, but like bringing in the designers, bringing in the folks from legal, bringing in, that we're all sharing experiences, that we're all sharing different points of view and different approaches around this subject matter. And we all take on different challenges together. And I think that is very interesting. It kind of forces this, we are going to work together. We are going to share our experiences, I think is really key. And I want to reiterate also something I said earlier with the design thinking approach. That exercise that I described to you about, the primary effects, secondary effects, tertiary effects, and then doing like a dichotomy mapping, which of these effects are beneficial, which are harmful, and then coming up with ways to design to mitigate for potential harm. This is gold. We've done this with clients. It takes 4 hours, 4.5 hours. You tell them, bring in your uncommon stakeholders to work together on this particular use case that you have in mind, and you watch it and you see the epiphanies happening within that 4-hour span. People saying, okay, now I understand why having a black box model probably isn't that good of an idea. We should probably have something that focuses on explainability and that there's a communication strategy around this. Oh, and that if people have concerns about the data that was used to make that decision, that they have the opportunity to challenge that data, right? And offer new sets of data. And just going through that process with people, I have found to be wonderful. And what I would ultimately love is to teach that approach about thinking through who could potentially be harmed, how could they be harmed, and then how do we design to protect against that harm? Let's bring that into schools. Like, not just higher ed, let's bring that into high schools. Let's bring that into middle schools. Like, why are we not talking about this earlier on in people's careers, and not just to those who want to be computer scientists when they grow up?
I love that. And Ayodele, I know you've done some education work, especially with data scientists. So as we come toward the close of our session, really wanted to focus on some practical advice. So Ayodele, we'll start with you. If you think about the audience here today, I know it's pretty diverse, but if you were to give them a piece of advice on what they could be doing differently, either resources or organizations or even just practices that they should be adopting, what comes to mind as something that would be helpful for making AI more responsible?
Yeah, I think I'll start with practices and then move into a couple organizations you can work with and partner with. I think the first thing I would say is something that I have naively done several times in my career is to assume that excluding like these sensitive features, it fixes the problem. Please don't do that. Please actually take the time to make sure that that you understand if they correlate with other things. There are steps you can take to ameliorate this bias and actually measure disparate impact in their fairly short Python code. So don't assume that it is too large of a challenge. And I know that's a very narrow example, but even broader than that, across your organization, I encourage you to be a champion for AI ethics or to be an advocate for both working with domain experts, subject matter experts, to make sure you even grasp your project conceptually. I think we have a huge issue with construct validity and making sure what we're measuring equals the same thing that we think we're measuring. So I would just try to be aware of some of those tactics. And then a lot of organizations that provide really, really great resources, I'd suggest Data for Black Lives, the Algorithmic Justice League. And if you are like mid or kind of later on in your career and you're experienced, you can also work with organizations like DataKind and Data for Democracy if you want to get involved and use some of your technical skills to try and improve this space.
Very good. I appreciate that. And Renata, it looks like you get the last word. So advice for people that are in the audience, something that they could be doing new or differently that would help us all make responsible AI a more practical reality.
Yeah, I think getting support from folks across across organizational structures. So not just having folks on the ground doing the work, but also making sure that you're able to bring in people from directors up will really get the work moving. So I think trying to build coalitions of people internally, externally, in order to make sure that that it's not just something that's bottom up, but is also top down. So making sure that there's that there's this type of alignment across organizational structures, I think will help the movement really take hold.
Very good. And I know there's way more that we could have addressed, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything. Hopefully you all can participate in the chat later. There's a lot of great advice and some really good organizations and practices to adopt. I think for me, one of the key messages that I started off, when I started in this space is we have to improve our conversations. We have to talk about these things in our, when we apply for jobs, right? When we talk through our performance reviews, when we talk through our design thinking and our planning for products. So I really appreciate the fact that David and the All Tech is Human team is bringing this diverse group of people together to talk through some of these issues. And hopefully we continue the conversation. But really appreciate the panel today. All three of you were terrific and great advice.